Good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm Richard Gearhart. You're watching a very special edition of KSBY News on Facebook. For the next 30 minutes or so, we will be talking in depth about what's happening in the Kristen Smart murder trial. We're calling this Beyond the Headlines because we want to take you beyond the daily reporting and dig deeper into some of the issues surrounding this trial. It's a complex case, more than 26 years in the making, and there's a lot to talk about. First, though, we want to get you up to speed with what's been happening in court. Last week, we heard more testimony about the last night Kristen Smart was seen alive, as well as details about the early investigation. That included a recording of an interview investigators conducted with defendant Paul Flores a few weeks after Kristen's disappearance. Former investigator William Hanley testified that some of Paul's statements during the interview were inconsistent. Also last week, thousands of pages of documents related to the case were unsealed, and we have learned that Paul's sister was offered immunity for her testimony. However, so far she has not been called to testify. And this week, court was in session for just 2 days. Testimony focused on the dog handlers who searched Paul's dorm room after Kristen's disappearance. Both search dogs alerted to the room and to his mattress specifically. Court will pick back up again next Wednesday. And we'd like to invite you to share your comments and questions in the chat below. And if we don't address your questions tonight, we will be compiling them for future episodes. And my guests tonight are both Cal Poly students and or graduates, one Olivia DeGennaro and current Cal Poly student Nico Vinuela. Welcome, both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Of course. And for transparency purposes, I want to say that obviously I teach at Cal Poly as well, and both of you have been my former students, but both have been or are actively covering the case. And so that's why I invited you today to kind of get your perspective, or maybe even a Cal Poly perspective, about how the case is going. And so even to get started, let's just briefly hear how each of you got involved and what your involvement so far in the case has been. Let's start with you, Olivia.
Well, I first learned about the Kristen Smart case when I was one of your students at Cal Poly, which was, gosh, over 10 years ago now. And I was really shocked by how little people on campus knew about Kristen's disappearance. At this point, there had been no arrests. They hadn't even called Paul Flores the main suspect in the case yet, I believe. And so it just piqued my interest, and I started doing my own research, kind of digging in. It eventually turned into my senior project, a 2-part series I published about Kristen's disappearance. And still to this day, I just feel so connected to the case and invested in the outcome in a lot of ways, because not only did I find myself enamored just by all the details and how much information there is in the case, but also there hasn't been a solution to it yet. So yeah, that's how I got involved, and still why I follow along, even though I'm not in San Luis Obispo anymore.
And how about you, Nico?
Yeah, I've been working with Mustang News for about a year now, and they told me that they were going to cover the Kristen Smart trial, and it's a case that Mustang News has followed for a really, really long time. So it's really important to the organization. And when the case got moved to Marina, my editor, she reached out to me and she asked me if I could cover it because my parents live there. So kind of just a convenience thing for me to be there and cover it. And I remember when I first came into Cal Poly, I had heard rumors of sorts of Kristen Smart, but nothing in detail until the podcast came out, and then I heard so many students talking about it, and I've definitely seen interest and just a lot of heightened sort of emotions around the case, around current students that I've talked to. So I feel grateful that I'm able to go and I'm able to cover it, and it's such an important story for the school, and it's such an important part of Cal Poly's history. So yeah.
So just kind of a timeline, interesting timeline perspective here. So I actually attended Cal Poly as well as a student in the journalism program. So I graduated early 90s. This happened in 96. Olivia, you were there around 2012-ish or so, 2014, I think is when you put the senior project together. And then Nico, more currently, and you've been sitting in court, I think you've been there almost every day, right? If not every day in the courtroom.
Yeah, I've been there every day.
Yeah, so why do you think over that stretch of time, that 25-year period of time, 26-year period of time now, why are Cal Poly students still interested? And you know, sometimes I think to myself, oh, it's obvious why they're interested. But then I'll think from a different perspective. You know, she was from Stockton, the Stockton area. She was here at Cal Poly for less than an academic, barely less than an academic year, but about 9 months, and otherwise has no connection to the Central Coast. Paul Flores and Ruben Flores obviously have connection to the Central Coast, but why is it that Cal Poly students are still so interested in this case? And let's start with you, Nico, first, I guess.
Sure. Well, I definitely, just from sitting in the court every day, I've definitely noticed, just from hearing witness testimony, that the party that she was at and all the events that led up to that night don't feel like it happened 26 years ago. I mean, it feels like something that could have happened last year. You know, it's a college party. It's people drinking, people going alone, people walking back home, people not knowing anyone. I mean, it's things that still happen today. And honestly, I mean, just from hearing from everyone who was at that party, I could totally picture myself there. And I think a lot of students at Cal Poly are concerned about safety a lot, for good reason. And I think this case just resonates with a lot of people still, because I think that people can see themselves reflected in Kristen, because she's such a regular person, and she was just such a regular student. And I think people still see themselves in her, and it doesn't really feel like 26 years ago when I'm sitting in there and I'm hearing the testimony, because it definitely feels like something that's still going to happen. And then also Chris Lambert's podcast, Your Own Backyard. People are really into podcasts these days, and I've definitely seen how that has affected students now and kind of caused a reemergence of interest in the case throughout current students. So many of them are listening to the podcast, and so many of them are paying attention. And it's nothing like I've ever seen before covering anything at Mustang News. I've never seen this sort of interest in a case. So yeah.
Yeah, and Olivia, we've talked about this before too. Like that was one of the driving forces behind you, right? Is just saying, hey, look, this is a girl who's just like me, and in fact, from your home or in the area of your hometown. And I think probably a lot of students feel like that, don't you think?
Absolutely. And I think Nico hit the nail on the head. The circumstances that led up to her disappearance happen every weekend at Cal Poly. And it does feel like it could happen, this weekend. Unfortunately, there's a lot of question marks still. And I think what resonates so much is the story that's told over and over again. She was at this party on Crandall Way. We all know where Crandall Way is, people who've gone to Cal Poly 20 years ago and people who are currently still going there. She walked up perimeter. You can visualize the walk she took, where she was going, the red brick dorms. It's all still the same. And so that story is so resonant with so many people who go to Cal Poly, went to Cal Poly, because we can visually see it playing out in our mind's eye. And I think also, why people are still so invested. As somebody who's now very far removed, or it feels like very far removed from being a student there, I see people's license plate frames that say Cal Poly San Luis Obispo all the time. And I instantly feel this like ping of pride, like go Cal Poly. Like I just feel really connected to everybody who's gone there, who's shared that experience, who's been on that campus. And so it makes sense why so many people who are tied to Cal Poly feel like they're tied to the Kristen Smart case too, because it's just, the situation is so reminiscent of so many situations many of us have been in during our time there.
We just got out of the courtroom not too long ago, and we are joined with our special guest today, Chris Lambert, who created the Your Own Backyard podcast. And so first of all, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day and joining us. Now, for some of our viewers, we haven't interviewed you, I don't think, directly yet for any of our stories. And so some might not know who you are, how you got started. Obviously not many at this point in time, lots of people paying attention to the podcast. What kind of got you interested in, how did you come up with the idea for the podcast?
It's a case I grew up with. I was 8 when Krista went missing, so it's something that most of my life there's been this billboard of a missing person that I didn't know a lot about. Once I got older, I remember Googling it a lot, trying to figure out why there hadn't been any update. In 2016, when they did that big Cal Poly dig where they brought out the FBI, it was on the news for a few days and then it disappeared again. And I just remember it came up a lot and then it would disappear, and it was kind of a frustrating thing. Around 2018, I had just finished making an album a singer-songwriter, and that's pretty much what I had been doing with my life up to that point. Put out an album and had like a week break where I had nothing to do, and I read a Los Angeles Times article that had been written all about the case, and I just got sucked in, and I thought, why has nobody made a documentary about this case yet? It's so frustrating that all the answers seem to be right there, but it just never got followed up on. There's so many little pieces here and there that are not reported on, and I thought maybe I should give it a shot and try to make a documentary. I'd never done anything like it before, though.
So, and I mean, it just kind of blew up, right? Like, so many people are listening to this podcast. Why do you think it catches the, sort of interest of so many people? I mean, you're a pretty typical person, who's into this podcast, right? Grew up with the case, and San Luis Obispo County and Santa Barbara County especially are just so interested in what's going on. What is it about the case that draws so much interest?
I think for one, it's a story that they were waiting for somebody to tell. I think what really catches people is just the big question mark. Where is she? Obviously, she was here. We know she walked home from this party, and in the first episode, I retraced her footsteps, and I thought that she was last seen right here, and you can see the door to her dorm room like 40 yards away. It just doesn't make sense that she disappeared in this distance. How could this have happened? And so wondering where her body ended up, knowing that the last person to walk her home seemed like he was hiding information from the police. He seemed like he was not forthcoming. He wasn't cooperative, and just trying to figure out like all the pieces seem to be here, but we don't know where her body ended up, and that's just very frustrating for a lot of people, I think.
So what was your goal with the podcast? To get information about, to actually see justice happening? And what was in your mind when you were putting these episodes together?
I think initially it was just to document what had happened in the case up to that point. When I started in 2018, there had just been a lot of silence for a few years after that Cal Poly dig, and I thought I just want to document what has gone on chronologically. But as I started digging through like newspaper archives and calling people and asking if I could interview them, I thought maybe there's something more that can be done here. Kristen's life story could be told, and I wonder if her family would have any interest in participating with this. Like if I reached out to them, would they be comfortable with me telling their daughter's story, getting to know who she was before she disappeared, as opposed to just the details of the disappearance? So that's where like a lot of my focus went, was the first episode needs to really establish who was Kristen Smart as a human being, and then from there it just turned into this big 6-episode project where it's like it's now the arc of who Kristen was from the time she was alive until today, when she's been missing for longer than she was alive.
So then this kind of grew into this whole huge issue. There's lots of stuff going on in the courtroom. Your name gets mentioned all the time in the courtroom. And we're kind of walking around in this era where we don't really know how to classify this, right? Is it podcast? Is it entertainment value? Is it journalism? What's the point behind it? And so, that gets talked about a lot in court too. Now, there's lots of talk about whether you would testify and whether you're not testifying. And so far they haven't called you. Kind of give us some of the background on the issues surrounding that.
Yeah, like from my perspective, it's always been a documentary. That's where I came from. So I feel like I'm in the role that any documentarian would be. I am a journalist, albeit not by trade. I didn't go to school to be a journalist, but I made a journalism project. That's what I put together. And so there was some issue when the prelim came up about, am I going to be credentialed as a media person, or do I have to go in as a public person, which would have been my preference. And when they designated me media, then this gag order kicks into effect where I'm suddenly not allowed to speak to anybody in the sheriff's department, anybody in the Smart family, anybody connected with the case in any way, because now I'm media and they're party to the case. And so it's been sort of it's like kind of like walking a tightrope. Like I'm trying to follow the case, but there's only a few people I can talk to about it.
Yeah, and it's kind of like this tightrope situation too, because being designated as media also gives you some protections against having to testify, right? Because we have that California shield law, for instance. And so, one of the questions I've never asked you yet, and we're obviously sitting in the courtroom quite a bit together, is, do you have a desire? Do you want to testify, or do you not want to testify?
That's really tough because I didn't see that coming up. Obviously, that was not something I was prepared for. But when I was subpoenaed during the preliminary hearing, I had no objection to taking the stand. But it was the subpoena ducis tecum that came with that, which was, we want all of your emails, all of your text messages, every communication you've ever had. We want all your raw, unedited interviews. And it just felt very invasive. And I called an attorney and said, is this legal? Can they do this? And that's where I learned about shield law and all of the First Amendment rights that are afforded to journalists, and had to kind of embrace that. Like, yeah, this is this is violating a lot of the privacy of a lot of people who opened up to me and had conversations about very traumatic things that happened regarding Paul Flores and interactions they had with him. And I thought, I'm not willing to turn that kind of stuff over, so I'm going to try to go about this the legal way, but if it comes down to it, I'm just not turning these things over. I'm not going to do that. And so it was quashed at the prelim, and then it came up again at trial. So I've been subpoenaed twice now, and with the same outcome.
Yeah, and there's like kind of multiple sides to this coin, right? Because the other thing is, if you were a witness, then you wouldn't be allowed to sit in the courtroom and listen to other witness testimony, and so that would kind of put a kibosh on future episodes.
Right.
And so you have been sitting in there. What's been your reaction so far to court?
It's my first time. I've never sat through a trial before, so a lot of it is just learning for me. And now we've been doing it for so long, it feels like we sort of get the routine. You recognize faces. We know the jurors. Like, we just recognize everyone now, and so it's been overwhelming. And I told somebody that the other day, and they said, "What's overwhelming about it?" And I just couldn't even articulate it anymore. It's like, I think I'm just emotionally exhausted. It's a very personal case for me at this point, because I did grow close to the family when I was interviewing them. I did grow close to a lot of the people who are now witnesses that at the time were just people sharing their stories. And so it's a very difficult thing when they call up somebody's name and I think, oh, I used to have a relationship with this person, and now because of the gag order, I haven't spoken to them in a year, and it's been sort of difficult to be in that position.
I want to talk about this next kind of issue in two different ways. So your name does come up a lot. Like, even in today, your name was mentioned multiple times, many times in the trial. So one is, back to that testifying kind of an issue. Does it make you want to actually be able to sort of respond in some way? Like nobody, we're not hearing from you, we're hearing all about you and
Right.
what everybody has said about you.
That has been the very difficult part, is especially with testimony like today's, there's things that get said that I want to defend, and I want to say that's not what happened. And that's the other side of the coin in not testifying, is that I can't defend myself. And so I've also been trying not to editorialize too much with the updates I put out. I try to just be factual about what I saw in the courtroom and what this could mean. And I don't really want to step in and say, this part is not true, this did not happen. This witness said this, but they're incorrect about when that occurred. And I don't want to do that while the trial's ongoing, because I don't want to step on the prosecution's toes and get in the way of what's going on. So I'm sort of waiting for the trial to wrap up before I can clarify some of those issues. I feel like that's a better way to take than taking the stand, when really I'm just going to be rigorously cross-examined
Right.
about every interaction I've had with anyone in the course of making a documentary about the case.
It seems to me, and this might be speculation on my part, but a lot of the defense sort of rests on you, right? I mean, like, using your name. There's been a lot of talk, and back to you defending yourself, I mean, there's been a lot of talk that the sheriff's department was using you to get information out and to sort of lure other witnesses in. What's it like to actually sit there in court and listen to your name said over and over?
Bizarre at first, and then kind of getting numb to it. But I think, luckily, my name is only brought up in the context of this entire defense, which is that Paul has been a victim of intense publicity from the start, which, if you reported the news over the years, you follow the news over the years, you know that Kristen's name was not a constant fixture of the nightly news. Paul's face especially was not. It was something that would pop up every now and then,
Right.
but it didn't stay in the news, and the billboard certainly, I don't think, tainted people's memories about what they witnessed. So my name is coming up in the context of this argument that there was just massive media publicity, media firestorm for 26 years, and the jurors really don't know that that's not true. And so pointing to my podcast is a way to say, well, this podcast was certainly a big deal. Everyone here has listened to it, everybody knew about it, and so it's just, I understand why they're using it, because it's something to say, well, the only reason all of these people have said such consistent things about my client is because they were influenced by this podcast they listened to.
Well, the reaction was, I mean, when I got there and found out early that there was a verdict, I was relieved. I was asked yesterday about how I felt, and it was a tough question for me to answer, because I hadn't really given it much thought, because I have such mixed emotions on it. I mean, I think the fact that we got Paul Flores into court and in front of a jury, I think, was really important to me. I mean, I believe in our system, and the conviction, I was happy for the conviction, because I truly believe that Paul was absolutely responsible. but on the same token, a little sad because we have not found Kristen, and that was always, my goal and our challenge. And so I kind of felt a little sad still for the family that we still had not accomplished that. So it was really a mixed bag of emotions for me.
Did you get a chance to talk with the Smart family at all yesterday?
Quite a bit. Yeah, quite a bit.
And what do they have to say to you, and what did you have to say to them?
They're super good people. They were super grateful for everything we did. I've had a long relationship. I accidentally said 2019 yesterday. It was 2009 when I first met them. And so I've had a relationship with them since, and, not knowing too much about the case when I met with them at the beginning, I just understood losing a 19-year-old first-year college student had to be extremely difficult, and I promised them that I would do everything possible to determine who was responsible and bring it to justice.
Can you walk me briefly back through that? I mean, you come into office, and then sort of making promises you're going to really look into this case. It still was a long time coming. What was that process like over those years?
It was, and my philosophy at the beginning is that we have to start at the beginning. I felt very strongly that you can't just take the case where it was today or that at that point and try to move forward. We had to back up. We had to rewind. So one of the first things we did was I had all the evidence in the case pulled out and gone through again, looking for any trace evidence, DNA evidence, anything we could find. Because as a response to a crime, we go to the scene of the crime, and that's the first thing we do. We collect evidence and we start interviewing people. Well, there have been a tremendous amount of people interviewed countless times, and I really kind of wanted a clean slate. Let's talk about what we can find evidence-wise. And we know we had some challenges with that, of course, because Paul moved out of the dorm, and so we didn't really have a scene that we ordinarily would have, but I think that was important, and also technology has changed tremendously. What we didn't find then, we might find now. So we had a pretty extensive search of that property that we had recovered, including our team, FBI team, and a Department of Justice team. They all worked together, and so we had multiple groups and multiple eyes. So I kind of had this hope going in that was going to be a real good beginning, and that we would really find something of significance. And so as time went on and we just kept going down one road, ended up being a dead end, having to do a U-turn, a left or right turn, and go to the next possible lead. Time just moved fast, and so, but the family never lost faith. I always told the family, look, there's things I can't tell you. There are things I couldn't say publicly because it would damage the case, but I'll always tell you if I can't tell you, rather than pretend that I don't know the answer. And they were really good with that. They were really good with understanding that, hey, I can't go there. I can't have that discussion. So a lot of my conversation with them is trying to give them enough to understand that things were being done. They just didn't know the detail of what that meant over the years. So, and trying to manage their expectations, because it's a tough thing to pick up a case that's that has gone unsolved that long. And so it was trying to keep them understanding that, hey, just because we're going down this road and we have this lead that we really are interested in, and it fails, doesn't mean it's over. We're just gonna keep going. And so they got to experience that a lot, where they would know we were doing a dig or we were doing something, and ended up not panning out. And so I think as time went on, we developed a pretty good relationship and understanding each other, and kind of came to expect regular contact with the Smarts. Either they'd come down here, I've been up there several times, or by telephone. Telephone was very common.
Through that whole process, obviously there were moments of frustration. Ever any temptation to give up on the case, or to not move forward? Yeah,
we reached one point where we just felt like we were out of leads. We felt like it was getting stale. It was, we were repeating a lot of things. We were chasing, you know, rumors and speculation that wasn't panning out. And so there was a point that we got frustrated, and you know, we had a long talk with the family. We went up to Stockton and met with them and talked about, you know, hey, where we're at and where our struggles were. But interestingly enough, that conversation kind of sparked some ideas for us. We talked about, well, what about this? Okay, well, we can consider that. So that was the only point of where we thought maybe we were at the end, and that conversation kind of invigorated us a bit to look at other things, and it kept going. It never stalled. But I was really concerned that we were running out of opportunity and finding real evidence.
So lots of talk about the podcaster, obviously, in court and yesterday during the press conference. How much of a role, you know, did he play in this?
Well, I think Chris Lambert brought a different perspective. You know, I've interviewed with you guys, you know, nearly every year, it seems, on anniversary dates and stuff. And the story gets out there. And I always wanted to do that because the more people that knew, the more people that heard, maybe there was something out there that people just didn't think was important, that it would spark them to say, maybe I ought to tell them this. The podcast kind of took that to a little different level because Chris did a great job of telling a story. So it reached people everywhere. And, you know, you imagine, you know, KSBY reaching a market of a couple few counties, and then you've got a podcast that's reaching across the country. So people that lived here, you know, were listening to it. People began to know the story and be really interested in hearing the whole story. And so I think that just getting the word out and getting people interested in it really helped. But then, you know, Chris had people approach him that were afraid to contact us. And so there was definitely some leads that Chris got that probably was purely due to his podcast.
So in terms of evidence, you know, how, when you were watching this sort of play out, there wasn't a lot of physical evidence, and we'll get back to, you know, to more of that in a minute, but no body, no DNA, no sort of smoking gun, if you will. Were you concerned as you were sitting there waiting for the verdict to come down?
No, I was hoping. I knew what I knew. I knew what I believed, and I knew what I believed we could and did prove. I always kind of said that, hey, this is what a jury is all about. They get to hear it and they get to make a decision. You know, you develop a sense when you're around a victim for a period of time. You want to help. And so can you get a little clouded and, wait, is this really it? Is this really enough? And that's challenging. But I kind of went in with it saying I really believe that we have proved it. And if the jury feels that we didn't, then that's what their job is, and I have to support that. Certainly I was appreciative of that. But the case, when you talk about smoking gun, there's not that many cases, believe it or not, that have a single smoking gun. A lot of them are built on a collection of things, physical evidence and witness statements. I mean, that's how we solve cases, period. And so this case was different because you have 26 years of investigation, and it was all basically piled into a very long narrative. A 3-month trial is absolutely unheard of.